If you want to start a container garden but have limited space or limited budget, bucket gardening may be the answer for you. I ran an experiment last year to grow food in these buckets, and I have the results. Today, I will show how to garden in a bucket, what are the best plants to grow in it, and what plants you should not grow in a bucket. These buckets are much budget friendly because they are cheaper than many garden containers. They are sturdy and well built, so they will last you for a few years. And they allow you to get similar results as any other garden container. A 3-gallon bucket is good for growing leaves such as kale, lettuce, etc. But for any other vegetable, pick a 5-gallon bucket. These are buckets, so obviously there are no drainage holes in them. But it is very easy to drill a few like I did. Having drainage holes is a must. Otherwise, water won't escape from the container and your plants will have root rot. I am making a very budget-friendly potting mix to fill these buckets. I will link a video in description on how to make it yourself. So do check it out after this video. These buckets are ready to be planted now, and you just saw how to get a bucket ready for growing plants. So follow similar steps. A lot of plants in garden containers grow very well in the beginning, but then the plant growth stalls. I find the same thing happening in bucket garden as well. Good thing is, I do have a solution for it, and I will show it to you during this video. But first, let us plant something in these buckets. I planted Roma tomato in one bucket because tomatoes are easy to grow and it is something everyone loves to grow. In this orange bucket, I decided to plant carrots. This will give me a good idea of how a root crop does in a bucket. The third one got a delicate squash planted in it. It is a medium-sized squash, but usually squash plants need lots of nutrients. So this one will show to us how a heavy feeder plant performs in a bucket. I installed OS spikes in each of these buckets to provide continuous watering to these plants. I will link these OS spikes in description if you are interested. I also added plant support for squash and tomato at the time of planting. If you add it later, you may disturb the plant roots which can set back the growth of the plant. While these plants grow, let me give you an idea of what kind of food is best to grow in buckets, and later I will show you with proof what not to grow so that you don't waste your efforts and space. I will also share 2 types of crops that do particularly well in containers. But first, let us talk about everyone's favorite crops. Cucumbers, peppers, and tomatoes. These happen to be some good plants to grow in buckets, if you choose the right variety. For example, a cherry tomato or a Roma tomato will give you better results than growing a beefsteak tomato. Same is true for cucumbers. Cucamelon and the pickling cucumbers types will perform better than the English cucumbers or Armenian cucumbers. Did you notice what I'm hinting at here? Let me say it out loud. For peppers, pick the smaller size pepper variety, such as the lunchbox variety, or alpenos if you crave some high spice level. Why not the large varieties though? Will they not grow in a bucket? The answer is they will grow in a bucket, but you probably will get just one decent harvest from them. After that, there won't be much harvest. Let me show it. When I was a beginner gardener, I grew beefsteak variety and mushroom basket variety in containers and buckets. I did get few good tomatoes from the first batch, but then only one more batch grew and it did not turn all red before the cold weather moved in. Compare this to the last year when I grew these larger varieties in ground, and it was my best tomato year yet. We harvested a lot of big tomatoes. There were many batches of it to be picked in every few days. Also notice how the tomato plant that grows in ground is much more prolific as compared to the ones growing in containers. The reason is that in containers the soil is in limited amount, so naturally the amount of nutrients available to the plant are limited as well. By the time we get our first tomato batch, the container has already spent all its nutrients on growing the plant from a seedling to a plant, and then growing some vegetable on this plant. Case in point, the same thing happened with this delicata squash that I grew last year in this bucket. The plant grew up, but it did not have enough energy to make any squash. There were hardly two male flowers, and the female flowers kept drying out even before they would open. I did water it well, but it did not make any difference. This was a clear sign that the soil has spent its cash. I still got a small squash from this plant though. How? After noticing that the female flowers were not surviving, I decided to rescue this plant by adding a fistful of an organic fertilizer high in P and K on the top of the soil. Almost 10 days later, the plant had a female flower that finally grew and bloomed. I hand pollinated it because I wanted this plant to produce something. Lucky for me, it worked, and a few weeks later, we had this delicata squash. But you can see it didn't grow much big, hardly the size of my palm. And after this, the same cycle repeated. The plant had really hard time producing anything. I wanted to leave it alone, but for the sake of this experiment, I gave it another serving of the same high pK fertilizer. This sent the plant into a frenzy mode where it started producing many female flowers, but there were no male flowers. I hand pollinated them with cucumber flowers, and one did pollinate successfully, but it didn't even grow to half the size of the first one. This whole observation is true for not only buckets but all kind of containers. Now let us see how a smaller variety performed in the bucket. Before we do, you can see it took a whole season to run this experiment and bring the results to you. I would truly appreciate if you can show your support by liking this video, commenting on it, sharing it, and if possible, subscribing to it. Even a single like makes a difference. A comment and share is even better. It keeps me motivated. In this other bucket, I grew a Roma tomato plant. Good thing was this one set flowers without any help from me, and soon I saw the first batch of tomatoes on it. You can see there is a whole bunch growing here. Once the first batch of tomatoes reached the size a Roma tomato should be of, I decided to give this plant a boost with the same organic high pK fertilizer. Soon enough, the next batch showed up, and then the next. I did not add any more fertilizer to it. I did harvest these tomatoes green because we had a frost warning. I could have moved this bucket indoors, but with so much to harvest because of the frost warning, it seemed easier to harvest these as well. So you can see I still got a better harvest and multiple harvests from this smaller tomato variety than just one harvest from the larger varieties or just one squash for the whole season. I had a cherry tomato also growing in a container, which was I think 7 gallon, and it performed very similar to the Roma tomatoes. But I had more harvest from it as compared to the Roma tomatoes. So the smaller the size of the vegetable, the better it does in containers. I have noticed it again and again. So you can use this knowledge to decide what to grow in your bucket garden or other containers. The third bucket had carrots in it. I mostly left it alone and did not fertilize this one. I did sow this one in June, so I knew these will be ready in fall. I truly didn't care for them much and watered them only when needed. Then, earlier this January, I decided to harvest it. I waited this long because cold weather makes root crops sweeter. So I got a good treat in January with these beautiful cosmic red carrots. Root crops are one of the two types of crops that do well in buckets. Carrots, turnips, radishes, and beets are good candidates for buckets and containers as well. I had my best beet harvest from a container. The second type of crop that does well in buckets and smaller containers is herbs. Think basil, oregano, thyme, mint. Herbs are very expensive to buy when you compare it to other fresh produce. And growing it in containers is very easy. I grow mine in a 3-gallon container and it does great. I get a lot of basil out of it throughout the season, so I'm sure it will do great in buckets as well. With container gardening, watering is a big challenge because containers dry out fast. I use Oya spikes to provide consistent water to the plants in containers. This next video linked on screen will give you all the details on what Oya is, how it works, and its benefits. Check it out next.